Welcome to USC at the Voice of College Football. This is Matt Zemek. Mark Rogers not here for this Tuesday, and it's going to be Maryland week, so we're going to be looking at the Maryland Terrapins. We have a guest lined up. Excited to have Patrick Stevens of the Washington Post aboard with us. He's one of the best sports journalists and sports analysts anywhere in the country. So very excited to have Patrick. When he comes on, we'll pop him up and talk about the Maryland team that USC faces this week, 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 Pacific. That's going to be on Fox Sports 1. But before Patrick comes on, I'm going to talk USC football. And hey, lots of late breaking news. Yep, it's Eric Gentry, Anthony Lucas. They won't play another game. They won't play another down for USC this season. And so when it rains, it pours, right? And you know, so much to kind of unpack and peel away from these stories. But really, before we get to Gentry and Lucas specifically, like at least USC, if it had been able to close down the Michigan and Minnesota games, and obviously the Penn State game that we just had was another missed opportunity, another close game slipping away. But my main takeaway from the Penn State game, before dealing with Gentry and Lucas specifically, my main takeaway from the Penn State game is, hey, where was that performance against Michigan and Minnesota? Because if USC had played Michigan and Minnesota the way it played against Penn State, a much better team, USC's 5-1. And USC still has its main goals available. We can debate whether those goals would be likely to be achieved, but those goals would be in play. They'd be available. USC would be 5-1. Trojans would be very much in the hunt, in the thick of things. You know, you wouldn't call them the Big Ten favorite. Not pretending that, especially with a loss to Penn State. Like USC would not have been favored to make the Big Ten championship game. But at 5-1, you're still playing for a 10-win season. You're definitely still playing for the college football playoff. You're definitely still playing for a New Year's Six bowl. I mean, you know, there are worse things to be than a New Year's Six bowl team. You know, you don't make the playoff, but you make the NY6. That's still pretty good. It's not unbelievable. It's not incredible, but it's pretty good. And it's the kind of thing that would get the recruiting needle trending in the right direction. I know that USC is not doing that badly for 2025 and 2026, but, you know, you then look at Oregon, you know, and the Ducks squeaked past Ohio State. I mean, Dan Lanning's recruiting is still in line to be elite based on what happened over the past weekend. Like, you know that the freight train's going to keep rolling for Oregon now that the Ducks have beaten in Ohio State and are almost certain to be in the college football playoff. USC needed to keep up. And with losses here, you know, that's definitely going to be an issue for USC. So, you know, the fact that USC lost to Penn State, obviously people are going to be frustrated that USC couldn't close this thing down after blowing a 14-point lead. But again, Penn State is a better team than Michigan and Minnesota. In many ways, it makes me think of why couldn't USC have played this well against Michigan and Minnesota to be 5-1. And so with those missed opportunities, and then you add the Penn State missed opportunity, 3-3, and now you add the Eric Gentry and Anthony Lucas injuries. And Anthony Lucas, bless his heart, like he tried. And you could tell he wasn't 100%. This was even before the injury. And you could also tell that, you know, the penalty called against him was utter rubbish. USC gets the short end of the officiating against Penn State. And meanwhile, Oregon gets every 50-50 call and that ticky-tack pass interference penalty against Ohio State, you know? So, like, just kind of turning the screw there, right? It was just an absolute SHIT sandwich of a day for USC on Saturday. They not only get stiffed by the Big Ten refs, you know, Mekhi Lemon getting manhandled, no pass interference calls against him, and then Oregon's getting every benefit of the doubt on calls against Ohio State. And pass interference was like called completely differently in those two games. Like muggings against USC receivers, not even called against Penn State. And then in Oregon, Ohio State, just even the slightest little touch against a Duck player, whoo, the flag comes out. So just that's how it's going. That's the way this season is unfolding for USC. And so with Eric Gentry out, USC loses its best defensive player There's no question that Gentry was USC's defensive MVP in September when he was playing. And, against Minnesota, with Anthony Lucas there on the field, USC was still leading Minnesota. USC held Minnesota to 10 points in the first 50 minutes of that game, even with Gentry not playing. And that's because Anthony Lucas was one of the guys really holding it down for USC in that game. But then you lose Lucas on top of Gentry, and of course Bear Alexander being out of the picture because he's redshirted and intends to transfer. It was a straw that broke the camel's back, right? That, okay, you can be without Gentry, you can be without Bear Alexander, but you can't then lose Anthony Lucas on top of those two guys. That's just too many bodies to lose, too many quality players to lose. And now we have the reality that USC is without Gentry and Lucas for the rest of the season. It's a crusher. It's a crusher. There's no way around it. And again, because this team's 3-3 instead of 5-1 or even 4-2, it's just going to be hard to get to a New Year's Six Bowl, any kind of high-end goal that this team had for the 2024 season. Troy is damaged. The citadel of Troy, not standing as tall or as strong as we all hoped it would midway through this college football season. So, if you're trying to deal with the frustration, the misery that surrounds USC football at this point, what else do you want to do? You want to look at the fact that younger guys are now going to get their chance to play. So this is a chance for USC to build for 2025. Okay, we have our guest on board. And without further ado, let's bring in Patrick Stevens. You can follow him on Twitter at Discourse, but the I is a 1. Patrick Stevens covering D1 sports. He covers cross, covers college basketball for the Blue Ribbon publication, one of my favorite journalists in the college sports sphere, here to talk Terps. So Patrick, welcome to USC at the Voice of College Football. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Give us just your general 40,000-foot view of Maryland football this season.
At this point, I would say that Maryland is clearly not as good as it was the last few seasons. I think they had basically as good a quarterback as they've had at any point in the last, 30, 35 years in Talia Tagovailoa. All-time leader in passing yards in the Big Ten. Obviously there's a good stretch of Big Ten history where passing yards were not exactly anything really anyone tried to amass in any large quantities. But Talia has that record. So he graduates, and they're kind of in a spot where they lost most of their offensive line. They lost a good chunk of their secondary. They just don't quite have as much as they have had in recent seasons. And as a result, the climb to, you're sitting there thinking, can they get to 7 wins and can they get to 6 wins? And it's starting to look awfully dicey at this point, having lost at home to Michigan State, giving up a lot of big plays in that game, having lost at Indiana by 2 touchdowns, even with a +4 turnover margin. And then last week coming out of the bye, just not playing great at all, really in the first and fourth quarters, and lose 37-10 to Northwestern. And Maryland is now 0-10 coming out of open dates since 2017, which is kind of a hard thing to do. So I think at this point, you look at their second half of their schedule, the 6 remaining teams on their schedule, a combined 27-10 at this point, including both Penn State and Oregon. So the path from 3-3 to even 6-6 is going to be really, really challenging for this group.
Okay, we're going to talk about Mike Loxley in a little bit, but not just yet. I think the larger reality of Maryland football under Loxley is that it can't get out of that 6-6, 7-5 box for the most part. And so, one of the discussions we always have in college football for whatever your school is what kind of program are you? Like just as a comparative example, like Georgia under Mark Richt, there was a debate. Is Georgia a 9-win program? Is Georgia a 10-win program? Well, Kirby Smart showed it could be better than than that. Do we just have to accept that Maryland is a 6 or 7 win program, or do you really think that something is being left on the table here and that the program can and should strive for better? I mean, the way it was under Ralph Friedgen, the way it was under Bobby Ross in the 1980s had some really good years. There was a guy named Boomer Esiason who played for Maryland. And of course, Randy White in the 1970s. Like, there have been some really good Maryland teams. You go back to Jim Tatum. Maryland was extremely good back then. So do we just accept the notion that Maryland is a 7-win program, or can this program definitely be reaching a higher standard?
Well, first off, you congrats on mentioning Jim Tatum, because that's dropping a great name there. Different time, different league, different resources vis-a-vis your competition. I don't see Maryland as being much more than a 7-5 program. And I think that if Maryland went 7-5 in perpetuity, that Mike Loxley, and I know you want to get to him later, but just any coach probably should be able to stick around for about as long as they want. The problem at Maryland isn't who the coach is, and it isn't who the athletic director is. Some of it's what league they're in. Just simply that they do not have the resources, and this sort of ties into the real problem. The real problem for Maryland is that it only has so many fans, and I'm not going to blame the fans that it has. There's probably like 30,000 people that care about Maryland football, and they show up every game, and they legitimately care. They really care, and they're not the problem. The problem is that there just is no way for Maryland to make really any kind of impact on a local consciousness unless they're really good. There is no chicken and the egg question when it comes to Maryland. It's not, this isn't South Carolina where the people just keep showing up week after week, year after year. And you take out those 3 Spurrier years where they went 11-2 all 3 years. I think it was 11-2 all 3 years. And, it's, there's some good teams, but there's not a lot of greatness in there. And those people still carry it on. And at Maryland, it just isn't that big of a deal in aggregate on a local level. It just doesn't move the needle. It doesn't move the needle in part because of all the pro teams. It doesn't move the needle in part because it's now been more than 20 years since Maryland won 10 games in a season. I mean, I could sit here and rattle off any number of numbers that just kind of illustrate where Maryland is as a program. Maryland's 0-34 against ranked Big Ten opponents since joining the league. I mean, there's not a lot that you're going to move the needle with if you're not knocking off one of those big name teams. But at the same time, because you can't fill your stadium, and your stadium's half as large as those big name teams, you can't even keep pace with these schools in your league. And it's just sort of this cycle. And so I don't think it's realistic to expect Maryland to be much more than a 7-5 team. I'm not going to sit here and tell you Maryland will never win 10 games again, because never is a long time. And you could get things break right where you catch a few breaks. You've got maybe an older team, your schedule works for you, and you go 10-2. That's not out of the realm of possibility. But as a sustainable thing, I just don't see it. And I think that going 7-5 every year, as frustrated as some people get with that, is a heck of a lot better than going 4-8 every year. And, if you make the wrong decisions, you could end up in that situation, particularly in the neighborhood you're in, even though I would say that I do think that Maryland's ceiling probably goes up maybe half a game or so, maybe a full game, from not having to play Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan every single year like they did for the last decade.
All right, let's just deal with some comparisons. And again, we'll talk about Loxley and this USC game in a little bit, but you obviously want to dive into your historical knowledge and awareness. You look at UCLA, look at Nebraska, other programs that haven't been relevant in about 20 years. They haven't done anything this century, and people will say, well, you can't win there, right? Based on roughly 20 years of struggle. So in that very specific sense, Maryland's in the same boat. But obviously there are things about Nebraska and UCLA that are different. But again, there are other programs that were good in the late 90s, turn of the century, and have been not very good for a solid 20 years. So I guess in terms of just handling that Maryland discussion, how do you balance that against other programs that have struggled for long periods of time? I would also add North Carolina State, NC State, Maryland's former ACC neighbor. Like, that's a historically downtrodden program, but you've seen Dave Doran bump up the standard a little bit. Obviously, this year hasn't gone well, but like, you've seen NC State knock on the door really without, too much of a football heritage of excellence. So against those various kinds of scenarios elsewhere in the country, how does that change the Maryland conversation in any meaningful way, if at all?
I think the most of the three schools you just mentioned, the best comp for Maryland is probably UCLA. UCLA, which has a bigger stadium and all that. But, you're talking about major metro area schools that can't come close to filling their stadium. And UCLA's heritage is better. But, if you compare UCLA's heritage to USC's, it's not the same. I think Nebraska is a place where people still care. Like, Nebraska falls into the Tennessee bucket, where you're like, well, if somebody figures this out, they're going to be fine. You could have sat there and said, from Vince Dooley until the middle of the Richt era, Georgia's like that. You could have said, go through a number of coaches at Alabama, except for, a couple of years with Gene Stallings, same sort of thing. So, I don't think Maryland's in that category. And I would argue that NC State is a program that is more like had a consistent level of like 6-5, 7-5, that kind of thing. Whereas a place like Maryland has, you look at the 1990s, it might as well not even exist. So, I think that's a little bit separate from that too, that you're just looking at a different kind of program. Again, I keep coming back to the issue at Maryland. Like, if you can't get people to care, it's hard to get over any sort of hump. And I can't say it enough. The problem is not the people that do show up. It's that they just simply cannot expand that fan base enough to be able to have more resources to work with, to have a better home field advantage, all of those things. I mean, this week is homecoming. Now, granted, homecoming's not a huge deal at Maryland relative to some other places. But I got an email on Monday that they sent out, I guess, to everybody on their various mailing lists, 40% off tickets for Saturday. Now, a lot of those seats are in the upper deck, and it doesn't include the rental of the Sherpa to get you up there. But, most of those seats are, this is one of the games they expect to make a fair bit of money on, and they're selling them for 40% off. And it's the smart thing to do because it's better than 60% is better than nothing. But there just simply is not a huge market for it. There just isn't a huge demand for it. And unless that changes, I don't think Maryland's ceiling is going to really change a whole lot regardless of who's coaching it.
All right, one more historical question before we get to Loxley and then this USC game. In the early 1980s, as you're very much aware, being one of the better historians of Maryland and ACC sports, in the early 1980s, ACC football was robust, really very significant, powerful national factor with, Bobby Ross at Maryland. NC State won the ACC in 1979. Danny Ford and Clemson win the national title in 1981. The Dick Crum North Carolina teams were regular top 10 teams at the very beginning of the 1980s. Really significant. Lawrence Taylor played there. Kelvin Bryant played there. Like Clemson, North Carolina, 81 was a top 10 game. Both teams ranked in the top 10 when they played. I'd have to think that Maryland football fandom and the Maryland fan base were big. It was a bigger deal, and it was more of a happening back then. Was there a moment that Maryland lost that ability to capture a larger share of the fan base? And when you think about like Penn State moving into the Big Ten in the 1990s, other shifts that we've seen in college football conferences, not in the past 10 years. I'm talking about like the 1990s with Penn State, leaving its independent status and becoming a member of the Big Ten, Miami going to the Big East, other things like are there some moments or periods of time that you can identify when Maryland had the potential to have a bigger fan base, to have a bigger following, and didn't capitalize on it, and that's why we have what we have today with the program?
I think it's important to remember maybe the single most defining moment for Maryland athletics in the final quarter century of the 20th century. And that was in June of 1986 when Len Bias died. And the athletic department is thrown into tumult. The basketball program obviously had to deal with any number of things when that occurred. And at the same time, you have all this extra scrutiny of the athletic department. And it was at the end of that 86 season, after Maryland had been, I think, to 4 bowls in a row under Bobby Ross. I think they went 5-5-1 in his last year. And that was when he left for Georgia Tech. And, having talked to people who were around back then, it just, the mood in College Park was funereal. And so, they hired one of Ross's assistants to take over, Joe Krivak, and he coached for 5 years. And then they had 5 years of Mark Duffner, and they had 4 years of Ron Vanderlinden. And, football that was kind of a point where it turned, where football just wasn't as important. And it wasn't the fault of those 3 individuals. It was an institutional thing. And there was a lot of just disarray that the department found itself in. And you think about college athletics in 1986 and you compare it to 2000, you're already starting to get into a lot of different things. You mentioned conference stuff. By the time, that's before Florida State joins the ACC. By the time 2000 rolls around, Maryland was routinely getting drubbed by Florida State year in and year out. So I think that is one of the biggest things, that ultimately led to a bit of that. And once you start losing, and those 14 years that I just mentioned, from 15, really, if you include the last Bobby Ross year, 86 to 2000, Maryland went to 1 bowl game. They tied Louisiana Tech in the Independence Bowl in 1990. So, that's kind of, you have a generation there that has no real sense of accomplishment. There's Duffner had a 6-5 team. That Independence Bowl team went 6-5-1. There's not much to latch onto. And then you have 3 great years under Ralph Friedgen. The rest of the decade was, it was average. You would say probably you would take everything but the 1, 2, and 10 that was thrown in there. There were a couple 5 and 6s. And then after that, you have Randy Edsall, and that didn't work. And you have DJ Durkin, and that didn't work. And so now you've had 20 years where your best records have been 9-4 in 2006, 9-4 in 2010. The last couple of years, 8-5. I mean, that's a relative high tide. And yet you're doing that, and you're still not really, besides those victories over Texas, right? Those early season victories in 17 and 18. They beat an overrated Syracuse team early in the 19 season. There just isn't that high-end victory that everybody's going to get super excited about, really, besides those Texas wins in seasons that ultimately didn't go anywhere. So, there just hasn't been much for people to latch on to aside from a 3-year stretch here. We're talking about nearly 40 years now. And, I would say that the bias situation and just the impact that it had on the athletic department as a whole definitely played a factor in all this.
That's why I enjoy your insights. That's the kind of historical context that I come to expect from Patrick Stevens. All right, so let's now go to Loxley. Jackson Johnson, thank you for the $2 super chat contribution. So how is Maryland feeling about Loxley? And of course, the Northwestern no-show obviously left a very bad taste in everyone's mouth. And I think, Patrick, just kind of on the heels of that, like, we've seen the Loxley era Terps. They've played Michigan tough. They've played Ohio State tough. and then you see the bottom fall out against Northwestern. I mean, that has to be the really annoying part, that you can see this program, it gets up for the big boys, and then it doesn't show up against the bottom half of the Big Ten. That has to be number one, right? Number one.
Yeah. I mean, you Northwestern this year, Northwestern last year, Illinois last year, Purdue one of the last few years. I mean, you can keep going through these games of like, if they just won this game, they'd have been better off. And like you said, you go through and you think about the Matt Canada year in 2018. He correctly went for 2 in overtime. It didn't work, but you play to win.
And the guy was open.
Like nothing wrong with that. They played Michigan tough last year. I mean, they did stuff to make life challenging. A couple years ago at Michigan, if they hadn't fumbled the opening kickoff and given away 7 points right at the start, that game probably would have been a lot more interesting. So there is this set of results that's all over the place. What I will also tell you, though, is, it doesn't really matter at this stage how anybody feels about Mike Loxley, because they owe him, if they wanted to fire him at the end of this season, they would owe him $17 million. Maryland doesn't have $17 million to give anybody not to work. And so, I think there's a lot of good things about Loxley. And I've always felt like one of the biggest things is that, and this is so underrated, and he shares this with Ralph Friedgen, he wants to be there, which I know sounds just kind of silly, but, you could take the approach at Maryland, and they did this thought was definitely in play with Durkin, is go get a guy who's coming up. He'll use it as a stepping stone. He'll make you better. You go get somebody else, repeat the process, basically. And I really thought that wasn't a bad idea to do that at that stage. But the way that things have worked out, I'm of the opinion that there's only so many guys that really want to be there and really, really love the area and love the place. And Mike this is his third different stint. He's been he was an assistant under Vanderlinden and Friedgen. He was assistant again under Edsel, and then the interim coach, and now the head coach. Like, this is he wants to be at Maryland. He wants to make a difference at Maryland, and that frankly matters. And if he's going to go 7-5, I mean, I don't know how much better you can realistically, in aggregate, expect. They probably left a couple games on the table, but they've also, I don't want to say that they've won some games that they shouldn't, because they clearly haven't knocked off anybody in the elite of the Big Ten since he's arrived. But at the same time, find me somebody who's going to do better and stay for a while. Find me somebody who's going to do better that actually wants to be there and is invested. And so, as long as, and I hate to keep going back to it, but as long as, you have a Friday night game in a stadium that seats 52,000 and your announced crowd is under 40, as long as you don't have people that care, it's kind of hard to get too upset when your results are maybe not this year necessarily, but your recent pattern is, well, this is a competent, if not spectacular program.
I would draw the comparison between Loxley, in light of everything you've said, to Justin Wilcox. Justin Wilcox not wanting to go to Oregon. Apparently the rumors were that he was at least offered the Oregon job when Cristobal left. No, he wanted to stay in Berkeley, and Wilcox just seems content to stay at Cal. He likes being there, and he's trading off. He doesn't want to climb, but in exchange for that, he gets job security. I think there's a very definite comparison to be made between those two coaches. All right.
And Wilcox is one of those guys that you look up and you go, holy cow, he's been there 8 years now?
Yeah.
You go, wait, what? Has he really been there that long? He's been there that long. And, for the most part, we're talking about something similar where they're never really bad. They're not always, they might get an 8-5 or something like that. But what's the worst since his first couple of years that they've been? Did they dip down to a 4-8 in there?
I think they might have been 4-8 once. Yeah, I think.
But usually, they're good to win 5, 6, 7 games.
Yes.
And this year, they're even with some of their injuries, they've been better.
Yeah, so definite comparison there. Just want to duck that in. All right, so let's now deal with the Maryland football team that USC is going to face. So, obviously the Northwestern game wasn't representative of most Maryland games. Like, what do you think, like, kind of the mean, the average Maryland performance is this season, and how likely do you think we're going to see something close to the mean? I think the Northwestern was an outlier. What's like a general baseline of what to expect from Maryland each week?
Well, this, excuse me. The scary thing with them, as you well know, like, how replicable are turnovers on a week-to-week? So they were plus 11 through 5 games. They were minus 4 last week. So that has something to do with what happened, obviously. I think that I'm sorry. I think they happen to be a team that's capable of staying in most games. I think that the clear shortcomings that they have seen so far this year are up front with a rebuilt offensive line, a story as old as time, and a secondary that, has graduated a fair bit of talent. They were down Dante Trader Jr., the safety, this past week, and it did not go well. Northwestern had 4 passes of at least 28 yards, and that's not exactly the most potent passing attack that anybody is going to see. Credit them for getting stuff done, but it was not a great performance by Maryland. So, I think those are the things that if you're USC, you would like to see your defensive line play well. You would like to see your receivers be able to make some plays, because I think those are Maryland's vulnerabilities. I think on offense, Ty Felton has had a fabulous year, the wideout. Didn't have an explosive play last week coming back from injury, but I do think that that's probably the place that Maryland has the best chance to do something, is in the passing game with Felton and with a few other guys, with Billy Edwards Jr. Doing his thing. And he got a little antsy last week, but he's generally been pretty solid for them. Not a guy that's going out and putting up Tagovailoa numbers, but certainly somebody that's had a good, solid season as a first-time starter.
You've talked about some of Maryland's vulnerabilities. What do you think Maryland can exploit with USC? And, as we started the show, we mentioned that today, 2 big pieces of news for USC, that defensive end Anthony Lucas and linebacker Eric Gentry both out for the season. Lucas with the injury that he suffered against Minnesota 2 weeks ago, and he aggravated it against Penn State. And Gentry, as had been rumored for the past few weeks, injured against Wisconsin, and like he has a concussion, and he's just not going to be able to play the rest of the season. He played only 4 games, so like he could preserve his red shirt, and he announced just this evening that he's going to red shirt, so he's not playing the rest of the season. So how do you think that changes the equation for Maryland? And if you are Loxley, what do you think that changes in terms of your game plan, if anything, against the Trojans?
Truthfully, if I'm Maryland right now, coming off the performance that I just had, I'm much more worried about just getting myself right. Like, I don't know if it really feels like one of those games where you're just worried about making sure you're doing the stuff you're supposed to do after having a performance where so much went wrong. And yeah, maybe that's an opportunity to have a little bit more time in the pocket. That would certainly help. But I think more than anything for Maryland right now, is worrying about Maryland and trying to figure out how to get things on track. Just because when you start looking at that schedule, they're not looking at it, but you can start doing the math where it's at Minnesota, bye week, at Oregon, Rutgers, Iowa, at Penn State. They need to get right themselves to have a chance to win this game. And winning this game is pretty important, just simply because it is a team coming from the West Coast, and that hasn't gone very well so far for these Big Ten newcomers. So I think this feels much more like a sort of a gut check game for Maryland than anything really X's and O's related.
And kind of piggybacking on what you've just said, this is a gut check game. I mean, my instinct is that, knowing Maryland the way I do, like, I think Maryland gets up for this game. Like, I think Maryland's going to be feisty in this game, at least for 2.5, maybe even 3 quarters. Because again, Maryland plays the big boys tough. Maryland puts up a fight. It's the Northwesterns and the other teams where Maryland really loses focus. So do you pretty much share that view that, like, late in the third quarter, this game's going to be close and competitive?
I do. I actually think that Maryland will be in this. And I think too, like, I haven't watched as much USC as you have, obviously. But I watched a fair bit of the team 2 years ago when they were pretty good. And that was a fun team. They didn't play much defense, but they got away with it. And then last year, there were enough nights that I had to stay up late to see, okay, is USC going to mess this up in this 10:30 window or not? And, the unmistakable sense that I took from it was like, this team isn't like, this defense in particular isn't very well coached, and they're not very disciplined, and they're not very technically sound. And, you're wondering, how much do these guys really want to be there? And I don't sense that from this USC team. I don't think I think there's maybe some talent limitations on the defensive end, but I don't think it's like last year where you're just like, do these guys even want to be here? So I do think Maryland, especially if they can do what they did in the middle part of the game the other night, which was they had, I think it was a 14-play touchdown drive and a 16-play field goal drive or something, or 16 and 18, where they were able to control the clock. And, they would love to have a few more big plays, but that was actually not a terrible way for them to kind of get themselves a little bit of equilibrium after a slow start. I mean, they're down 17-0. They got to within 17-10. And then the fourth quarter was just a mess with the turnovers. So I do think it'll be a better version of Maryland this week. I do think that sort of embarrassment probably got everybody's attention. That already, even before Friday last week, Mike Loxley had taken the play calling duties away from offensive coordinator Josh Gaddis. So there's a little bit of a different element to that as well. And so I do think Maryland plays better. I don't know if it's enough to win, but I certainly would expect them to acquit themselves better. They usually haven't, under Loxley, had 2 true duds in a row unless there was a real injury issue in there.
Okay, winding down our segment with Patrick Stevens, just a couple more items before we let you go. Want to honor your time tonight on the East Coast. Is there a specific one-on-one matchup that you think is particularly central to this game? Like, if one team wins this matchup or loses it, like, that could swing the pendulum in one direction or another?
Yeah, I think if Felton can get going, the Maryland receiver, Ty Felton, I think that would really, really help out. And when you look back to last week, his longest catch last week was 13 yards. And this was a guy who would come in leading the Big Ten in receptions, leading the Big Ten in receiving yards. He still does, but he got to that point by having a fair number of big plays, and they just simply did not stretch the field very well in the passing game. So if they can do that, they're going to have a much better chance than if they're trying to dink and dunk. I pointed out those long drives. The truth of the matter is that it's probably not going to be as doable to have long drives against USC as it was Northwestern. Although that was a feisty Northwestern team that they came out and had a gut check type game last week. And maybe Maryland is able to do a little bit more damage against USC. Maybe not. I think it's probably a gut check game for USC too after the last 2 weeks.
Absolutely. All right. Last question, Patrick. Whenever I talk to Big Ten writers or people who cover Big Ten schools, especially in this 2024 season, the first season of the geographically expanded Big Ten, want to get a sense of what people think about the new reality of travel and time zones. And you briefly alluded to this, that the multiple time zone travel has not been kind to teams in the Big Ten so far this season. With all that in mind, how disappointed are Maryland fans that this is not a noon game? And we all remember, and I know you remember this. I remember
California.
The Kevin Riley, Jeff Tedford, Cal just completely body snatched. And I know that Maryland fans remember that.
That was at the beginning of the 2008 season. I think it was the second week of the season. And the memorable part of that was that Cal flew out on Friday, which wasn't very smart.
Nope.
Like everybody, at least in the Big Ten right now, is like, well, we're going out at least 2 days early. And, the Big Ten, to its credit, has done a fair bit of scheduling so that teams are coming out of their byes and doing that sort of travel coming out of their byes. Like Maryland's going to go to Oregon early next month coming out of an open date. So, yeah, that is probably the last West Coast team to have come in. I know that was Cal was, the body clocks were not right. They got him back the next year. It was a 10:30 game out in Berkeley, and Maryland, we're talking about a Maryland team that doesn't have an offensive line or has a new offensive line. That was the exact same thing in 2009. And they went out there, and I think the final was like 51-13 or something along those lines that was thoroughly uncompetitive. So, I think, it's funny. UCLA is getting those noon kickoffs, and USC is getting treated a little bit better when it comes east.
Not that it's helping USC much to this point, but the final item is, Maryland hasn't yet had a late, 11 p.m. game at Washington, at Oregon, UCLA, USC. What's been the discussion around Maryland for when that eventually happens? Obviously, it's not an immediate point of concern, but what has been the discussion in college?
I don't know if there has been much, just because, their only trip out west this year is to Oregon, and that's probably not going to be a late night game. So, sorry. But I suspect that it'll be one of those things where you just kind of have to roll with it. Everybody's going to have to take their turn. It's funny. You're sitting there thinking about like the schools that refuse to play on Friday nights and whatnot, and this, that, and the other. It's like, well, you're going to have to take your turn doing this no matter what, no matter how snotty you want to be. So, I think that if you're like, let's say Rutgers, which is going out west it's coming to USC next week, right? For an 11 o'clock Friday night game. I think you'd almost rather do it coming out of a bye. I think they're coming out of a bye, but it's definitely, you get the extra time going back. You'd probably rather do it on Friday than on Saturday. 11 o'clock Saturday would be pretty rough, especially if you have to go back east and play the next week. So it's one of those things where you're almost trying to guess, where are we going to shortchange ourselves? Where are we going to cheat ourselves and hamstring ourselves for 1 week or another? So just a wonderful, wonderful mess, thanks to the world of college sports in 2024.
Well, Patrick, you're wonderful. No mess involved there. Patrick Stevens of the Washington Post, Blue Ribbon College Basketball, also covers college lacrosse as well. One of the best sports journalists in the United States. Very honored to have you on our program here with USC at the Voice of College Football. Patrick, all success covering Maryland and all the other sports that you cover in the DMV and elsewhere. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, folks. Patrick Stevens, he's great. You should follow him if you're a hoop head. Just loads of college basketball coverage. But you can see he knows his stuff about Maryland, ACC history, Maryland history. So great to have him on here at the Voice of College Football. So back to USC. All right, now that we've talked about Maryland. So earlier, before we brought Patrick on, again, my main takeaway, where was that performance against Penn State, against Michigan and Minnesota? Because that performance would have been good enough. But as we now kind of look at the Penn State game in microcosm, one of the interesting things about the criticism of Lincoln Riley, and hey, if you've been reading Trojans Wire, you know I've been very, very critical of Lincoln Riley. Like, you don't get prizes for coming close. You don't get much of any credit for almost winning games. Like, you don't come to USC for that. Riley's not paid a huge gob of money to almost win games and to be as prickly and defensive as he is about just being a couple plays away. Like, USC is just playing to the level of the competition every week, whether it's Minnesota playing down to the competition, whether it's Penn State playing up to the competition. I mean, this was a solid performance by USC overall, but again, you don't get medals for being close. And so, obviously people are upset that USC blew a 14-point lead, and they're obviously upset with Lincoln Riley. And I'm upset with Lincoln Riley over a number of things, but the thing that kind of gets me, and the thing that just seems off, it seems really weird. Lincoln Riley's play calling, as though that is the thing that's losing USC these games. I'm not saying it, folks. I'm not saying it. USC, without an elite offensive line, and with Miller Moss, a quarterback who, again, he was always going to need help. His teammates, his offensive linemen, the other people around him, he was always going to need help for all of this to come together. And USC puts 30 points on a Penn State defense that's probably not going to allow 30 points to many other opponents. Now, maybe to Ohio State, and maybe one or two others, but Penn State's not going to be allowing 30 points to many other teams. USC's offense did fine. Now, it didn't do great, and that's the difference between winning and losing, but Lincoln Riley's play calling, I don't think that stands out as the main reason USC lost this game. The Trojans consistently moved the ball, beautiful touchdown drive to take the 30-23 lead in the fourth quarter, and then the defense had 2 fourth downs to get off the field and win a ball game, and the defense couldn't do that. And I think that if you're looking at really the main problem, the main deficit, the main shortcoming for USC football right now, Lincoln Riley is the guy at the top, and he's responsible for this. And I'm going to name Lincoln Riley's specific failing in just a bit. But it's not the play calling, okay? The main reason USC is in this position is that USC does not have nasty skull crushers on the lines, okay? Offense and defense. The offensive line played really well for about half of this game against Penn State, but got its doors blown off in the third quarter when Penn State made the comeback. And that's been one of my themes with this USC team this season. It's a 30-minute team, maybe 35. But other than the Utah State game, and Utah State is terrible, that's a cupcake game. It really deserves to be shoved aside, put in its own separate category. There has not been a game, not even LSU. I'd say against LSU, USC played 40 really good minutes, but LSU controlled parts of the second half, had a few moments in the first half, when it was kind of a stalemate. I think USC was better than LSU for about 40 minutes, 2.5 quarters. Haven't seen one game in which USC has clearly been the better team for 3 full quarters. Forget 60 minutes. Let's just start with 45. Has USC been better than its opponent for 45 out of the 60 minutes in a game yet this season? No. And again, we're tossing out Utah State. So that to me is Lincoln Riley's failure to generate consistency with this team, but the lack of consistency is coming from the shortcomings on both lines. The offensive line has at least one excellent quarter per game and one decent quarter per game, but then what about the other 2 quarters? Just can't put 4 consistent quarters together. And on the offensive line as well, forget about quarters. Just think about high leverage possessions, right? The possession against Michigan with 5 minutes left in regulation, offensive line got dominated on that particular possession. Think about the 2nd and 5 at the Minnesota 36, up 17-10, early fourth quarter. Offensive line gets blown up on a running play that goes nowhere. Then 3rd and 4, Mason Murphy loses the contain on the pass protection, leads to the interception that changes the game against Minnesota. So that was another hinge point possession, defining possession. And then also USC's possession when the game was tied at 17 after Minnesota's touchdown. USC's offensive line didn't play well then. And then against Penn State. And I know, again, I referenced this earlier in the show that the Big Ten refs were horrible. Mekhi Lemon got mugged. That should have been defensive pass interference. We might be having a different conversation right now. But, you can't play games so close that one call is enough to move the needle in the wrong direction. And USC had a 14-point lead. That offensive line couldn't slam the door shut in the third quarter. It played its worst quarter of the game when USC had a chance to pull away from Penn State, gain some separation, and then you get into overtime, and the USC offensive line gets dominated in overtime. So on the high leverage possessions, Michigan with 5 minutes left, the 2 fourth quarter possessions against Minnesota, and overtime against Penn State, the USC offensive line has not played well in those high leverage moments. And that's what great teams do. They play well, not just in general, but in the high leverage, high pressure moments, USC's offensive line not rising to the occasion. The overall performance, if you're grading USC in terms of 60 full minutes, USC's offensive line definitely better against Penn State than it was against Minnesota. So that's good, but still not good enough, and still not elite in those moments when you need to rise up and you need to be at your very best. And then now let's flip it to the defense. And obviously, without Anthony Lucas, that's a problem. That's a shortcoming. Obviously, not having Bear Alexander as well. There are some depth concerns, and I know that Gavin Meyer got dinged up as well. But we talked about this in the offseason, folks, right? You're watching our USC shows here at the Voice of College Football. This was discussed a lot. That if prime players, if the frontline bodies were unavailable, would USC be able to call upon enough quality depth, and would the younger guys on the roster be good enough to keep the ship afloat? And that's been a struggle. And so it really points to Lincoln Riley's main failure. It's not recruiting well enough, not portaling enough, not getting the elite quality linemen, offense and defense, to give USC that muscle, that nastiness, that takeover dimension in the trenches. USC just does not have the horses, at least not to this point, at least not based on what we have seen. USC has not been able to have the pass rush, to bother Drew Allar. Drew Allar did not play a very good game. He was not sharp. He was there for the taking, but USC couldn't bring him down. USC couldn't hammer him. Allar had clean pockets in that second half as he led the Penn State comeback. So USC's pass rush not able to get home, and it reflects the reality that USC doesn't have the really big fish, the extra twitchy, athletic guys who can make a difference. And it was very painful. Again, I know that people don't want to hear this, but this is a college football analysis. This is what we're here for. An analysis of a 3-3 USC season. Don't blame the messenger, right? Blame the team for being 3-3. And for us having to comment on losses more than wins in recent weeks. But it was painful to watch Derek Harmon of Oregon, get a takeaway against Ohio State and make some high impact plays in the really big showdown in Eugene. And USC wasn't able to land Derek Harmon. And that's just the kind of thing where, Oregon is primed to continue to get the really big fish. And USC not only has failed to make up ground, you can imagine a scenario in which USC continues to lose ground to Oregon. And we saw Oregon pick up a modern-day lineman over the weekend on Sunday, right after the win over Ohio State. And it points to Lincoln Riley not being able to lock down modern day and get his share of recruits from there. So it's not Lincoln Riley's play calling. I mean, you can look at even the best play callers and you can find 3, 5, 6 plays on the play sheet every game that didn't work out. It's not as though Lincoln Riley is failing to put his players in position to succeed. I mean, USC with a 12-play, 91-yard touchdown drive against Minnesota to take the 17-10 lead was in position to seal that game. Riley did not abandon the run. He runs on 1st and 10. He runs on 2nd and 5 on that drive into Minnesota territory. But then Mason Murphy misses his assignment on 3rd and 4, interception, game changed. That wasn't Lincoln Riley's play calling. That was more about just guys not executing. Lincoln Riley was still running the ball in the 4th quarter, trying to put that game away. Guys didn't execute. And here against Penn State, had a 20-6 lead. A beautiful 4th quarter touchdown drive to take the 30-23 lead. Defense can't get home on the pass rush. On 4th down, Drew Allar does make a few good plays, but still, defense was 1 play away, couldn't make that 1 play, and the game goes into overtime, and that's a coin flip. And then that 1 bad possession from the offensive line. USC just doesn't have that standard of line play that we remember from the Pete Carroll era, that we remember from any great USC era. I mean, of course, in the late 1970s, under John Robinson, and of course under John McKay, USC had the biggest, baddest linemen in college football. And now people will say, well, that was not a quarterback's game back then. You didn't have RPO. You didn't have spread passing concepts. All right, but other teams were in the same boat. Other teams were pretty much in the same strategic position at USC in those long ago eras, and USC had the best. USC had an amazing offensive line room in the late 1970s. All the guys on that team, all the top NFL draft picks that the program cranked out, and you had the Wild Bunch back in the late 1960s as well, and then all the bone crushers on the great early 1970s John McKay teams as well. And then you translate that to Pete Carroll and Wild Bunch 2 in 2003. I mean, that's where great teams are built. And that was the John McKay way. It was the Pete Carroll way, that you started with the muscle and the power and the dynamic takeover athleticism in the trenches. That is what Lincoln Riley has not been able to deliver to USC. Like, he's clearly been left behind in that regard. And I mean, Josh Henson not landing the big 5-star offensive lineman. I mean, Josh Connerly is part of that Oregon offensive line, which held Ohio State's heralded defensive line at bay. I mean, that Josh Connerly loss continues to haunt USC football. Again, people are going to hate hearing that, but like, can you really deny the how impactful that recruiting loss was for the Trojans? It just, those accumulated losses, those accumulated failures to stockpile the very best talent. I mean, USC has good talent, but you can see Oregon has better talent. And that's why Oregon is living the dream, and the Ducks are where they want to be, where they hope to be, where they expect to be, and USC is not. So this is talent acquisition. And I think that when people talk about Lincoln Riley's play calling being the problem at USC, I mean, it's when a play call isn't right, or when a play call goes poorly, like, that's such a tangible, obvious thing, right? It's in front of you, you're seeing the game live. Oh, he could have called a better play there, so that's why this game went wrong. But you have to look at this thing in aggregate, that there are moments when it all comes together for Lincoln Riley. There are moments when it doesn't. But over the course of 60 minutes, does USC have the dudes? Does USC have the elite players at the very top of the sport? And it's really hard to say that USC does. Now, if you're going to say that USC actually does have the very, very best talent, well, it's not being coached very well. But it's less about play calling. It's more about USC being unable to physically impose its will on its opponent all the time. It happens for about 15 to 20 minutes, when USC's in great form, but that doesn't sustain itself. USC's playing like 20 great minutes per game, 20 ordinary minutes per game, and then 20 bad minutes. And the 20 bad minutes were from halftime into the early fourth quarter. Those were the bad minutes, and it was precisely at a point in time when USC had a chance to really step on Penn State's neck, boot on the throat. You have a 20-6 lead. Let's now put this game away. Let's not let this game be decided in the final minutes. Let's not let this game be decided by a horrible non-pass interference call against Mekhi Lemon. Let's put this game away. Let's make sure that when we get down to the final 3 or 4 minutes of the game, we're up by 10. We're up by 14. So if one really bad call goes against us, Penn State gets a touchdown it didn't deserve, we're still leading. And we can still just get one first down and run out the clock and celebrate a victory. But no, USC is allowing these games to come down to the final few minutes. Trojans have been horrifically unlucky. And by the way, I just happened to notice a podcast from a guy named Pat Dooley. He's the longtime sports writer of the Gainesville Sun, covered the Florida Gators. He had Steve Spurrier on for a guest segment, and Spurrier said on this podcast, this was just Monday night, he said USC has to be one of the unluckiest teams in the country. So Steve Spurrier is noticing how difficult a run USC is having. And there is no question that the Trojans have been horrifically unlucky. But what do we always say in sports? Play well enough that bad luck is not going to beat you. Be up 10, be up 9, so that if you give up 8 or 7, you are still ahead. If a call jobs you, if a call gives the other team a touchdown, you're still ahead in the final minutes. And this was one of my talking points, right, folks? That give USC a 14-point lead at halftime, you're going to see the defense clamp down. Well, not having Eric Gentry mattered, not having Bear Alexander mattered, and then Anthony Lucas losing the game, Gavin Meyer, getting dinged up a little bit. All of that mattered, but like USC still had that chance to show that it could protect a 14-point lead. Couldn't do it. Allowed the game to be decided at the very end, and the Big Ten refs once again, gave the call to Penn State instead of USC. A lot like Michigan. The Michigan game, calls went against USC, but really that game didn't have to come down to the final 2 minutes. USC could have done things to put itself in a better position before the final 2 minutes. So it's a broken record. It's kind of a repetition of themes, a repetition of realities and outcomes that are awful and are difficult for everyone to take. USC just has to find a way to transcend. And that's why, Lincoln Riley saying after the Minnesota game, well, we're just a couple plays away from being unbeaten. I mean, some of you might think that's fine, and like narrowly, you could even say it's true, but how many teams can say that, folks? How many teams can say, well, if that play had gone differently, we'd be unbeaten? Like, look at Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss. Look at former USC coach Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss. Ole Miss could say the same thing. If it hadn't, made that one bad play against Kentucky, if it had gotten that one fourth down stop against LSU, Ole Miss would be unbeaten. You can play this game forever. You can play this game with so many different teams. And you don't come to USC to complain about being one play away and getting a bad call. You come to USC to finish the job. You come to USC to be better. You come to USC so that you have a 10-point lead with 2 minutes left and that a bad call is not going to sink your ship. So it's an accumulation of nightmares and familiar scenarios. But USC does not have the line play, and USC has not acquired the caliber of player up front needed to separate itself from the opposition. So we can kind of nibble around the edges of Lincoln Riley's play calling. A few calls here and there haven't been great, but you did score 30 against a Tom Allen Penn State defense. That should hold up most weeks, but it didn't hold up this week. And so as USC goes to Maryland, we just need to see USC put its foot down, play at least 3 good quarters. I'd love 4 complete quarters. I'd love a 60-minute game, but I'll start at 45. I'm not going to try and be greedy. Give me 45 quality minutes. Be the better team for 3 full quarters, because USC at most has been like a 2.5 quarter team. It's generally been a 30-minute team. Just give me 45 quality minutes in which USC is the clearly better team for not just for 40, for 45 minutes. And let's see where USC can go if it can meet that standard against Maryland, against Rutgers, against Washington. And then let's see where we are when we get to that off week in early November. Let's see if USC can raise the bar against Maryland and start playing at that higher level so that the final 2 minutes, we're not all sweating a 1-score game and we're not all wondering, oh, when are the Big Ten refs going to screw us next and turn this game in the other direction? If USC can be up 10 or 9, at least 9, because that's the 2-score threshold, right? If USC can be up at least 9 points with 2 minutes left, Big Ten refs can't touch us. They can't hurt us. They can't hurt us anymore. So that's where we are with USC. No Mark Rogers tonight. I expect Mark to be back next week. And you can follow all our other USC shows here at the Voice of College Football. Like, subscribe, share. Just be sure to be partaking of all of our shows, including Tim Prangley's show. And so with that, thanks for listening for this week here at the Voice of College Football. And we'll take you out with a word from our sponsor here at the Voice of College Football. So long, and we will see you next week.
College football is even more exciting with some action on the line. And the games are even better when you're cashing in. And the Voice of College Football is the place to be to get the greatest value. Let's start with my picks. 75% against the money line, 58% against the spread. I've got a 40-year track record. In fact, in 2023, at $100 played per game, you would have netted over $9,300. And guess what? I'm just the warm-up act. Steve Merrill, our ace in the hole, show stopper from Wager Talk. 6 years with the Voice of College Football, over 30 years in the industry. Steve gives us analysis on all the big games, but you can't miss Steve's weekly under-the-radar pick, which went 21-5 against the spread the last 2 seasons. I repeat, 21-5 against the spread. You also get picks from some of our top analysts here at the Voice of College Football, including Steve Dace and Matt Zemek. Become a YouTube channel member or Patreon member for just $99 per month. Go to the main channel on YouTube, click join, and select the betting tier. Do the same thing on Patreon. Make 2024 a winner now.